Hello, everyone. So for today's video, I'm going to show you guys a step-by-step process of how to use Jira Xray. So in today's video, I'm going to cover lots of things. I'm going to show you guys step-by-step of what your stories could be and how to test them, and as well as how to create versions for your stories and how to make sprints, as well as seeing the traceability reports and coverage reports for your tests. So starting off, what I have here is a calculator on my screen. What I want to create is a version. So this is version 1.0. And in this version, I'm going to add a feature called addition features. So I want my calculator to add. So in my addition features, I'm going to have the following stories. So I needed to add 2 numbers, and I also wanted to add 3 numbers. So these are what my features would be. So we will turn these into stories. So obviously now that we have stories, we need to test if they're going to work or not. So from these, we will create test cases. So our test cases are going to be for number 1, add 2 numbers, for number 1 and for number 2. So 1 and 2. So we're going to create test cases for our 2 stories, 1 and 2. And to make it more organized, we're going to create a test set. Now, what a test set is just like a big folder. You can think of it as a folder where I just contain my test cases. So it's more organized. So if I want to see addition features, if I want to see all the test cases that I made for addition features, I can just look into my test set, which will contain these 2 test cases. Version 1 is going to be our first sprint. So that's going to fall under our first sprint. And obviously when we make our test execution, which is essentially just you executing your tests. Yeah, so our test execution is just going to be a user collection of tests, a user determined collection of tests. It's basically just going to monitor and verify if your tests are working or not. So in our test execution for sprint 1, we're going to add the test set, and we're going to run our test execution and to basically see if it's working or not, if there's like any bugs or defects in it. Now, this is for version 1, which falls under sprint 1. Let's make another version, version 2. So let's make subtraction features. We're basically going to cover these test stories by making test cases for them. So we're going to create test cases 3 and 4 for our stories 3 and 4. We said before we're going to place them under a test set. Our test set is going to be called subtraction features test set. So now that we've created a test set for our subtraction features and we added new features in, we want to test previous features as well. So let's say we make features for subtracting numbers, but what if that messes up our addition features? So we always want to test our previous test cases as well to see if anything hasn't been messed up or not. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to create another test set. And this test set is going to be called the regression test set. And in our regression test set, we're going to add all test cases from our addition features as well as our subtraction features. Right, and when we make a test execution for this sprint, we're going to add in our test set for subtraction features as well as the regression test set. So 2 things are going to go into test execution. So now you can see how the calculator project is looking. So there's 2 sprints, 2 versions. There's going to be stories for each version as well as test set, which is going to contain test cases. And we can see the execution for each sprint. Right, so that's for version 1. For version 2, because we're making a new set of stories and a new set of test cases, we're going to need to make a regression test set. So we're going to add that into our test case execution. So if you want to add more features into your calculator, say division or multiplication, you're going to add in new stories, new test cases, but you want to add test cases to the regression test set and test that as well to make sure everything's working from your previous features. So now that's the general idea of what I want to do. Let's move on to actually implementing it in Jira Xray. What I have up here is just me creating a new project. So I'm going to do it through Scrum. I'm going to use a template, company managed, and let's call it a calculator project. And let's create that project. Okay, so first things first, we want to enable Xray features, and I've covered this in my previous video. So we're going to enable Xray settings, and I've done this before. We're going to add issue types. Add Xray issue types. We're going to go on to miscellaneous, and we're going to enable project settings. We want to click save. For test coverage, we're covering stories, or we can also do epics as well. We're going to save that as well. And we're going to go on to defect mapping, just bugs. Okay, so we have enabled Xray settings, all well and good. Let's go on to creating our sprints. So we're going to create a sprint 1. And we're going to set our first version. So again, version 1 for sprint 1, which is going to be addition features. So let's create a version here. Let's call this v1.0 description addition features. You can also enable a start date and a release date. Okay, this is going to be addition features. Let's create stories. So our first story is going to be add 2 numbers. So let's add that in, add 2 numbers, and we're going to assign the version 1.0 here, and this is going to be a part of sprint 1. Let's create that in. Okay, that's one story. Let's add in another story, which was add 3 numbers. And let's fix that in for version 1, and let's assign it to sprint 1. Okay, so now we have our 2 stories in. Let's test them. So for tests, we're going to create a test. So this is going to be test case 001, add 2 numbers. Let's create it. Actually, before that, let's also fix a version to it. So version 1.0. Again, assign a sprint, and let's create it. Okay, so we're going to go into this test case. So I'm just going to control and click so it can take me to a different tab. So we're going to have to create steps here. So I'm going to add in a step. Let's make a new one. So again, this is basically what are we doing with this test case? So this is to add 2 numbers. The action is going to be add 2 numbers. The data is what numbers is it going to be? So it's going to be numbers 2 and 3. And the expected result, let's say the output is 5. Let's create that. So that's our test step. Let's go back to backlog and make a new test. This is going to be test case 002, which is going to be add 3 numbers. So again, we're going to do the same thing, fix the version to it, and let's select a sprint, which is sprint 1, create that in. Same thing here again, we're going to add in the steps. So similarly, because we're adding 3 numbers, we're going to add a step where the action is to add 3 numbers. So add 3 numbers, numbers 1, 2, and 3, and the output is 6. 5, 6. Let's create that. Okay, that is our step. Going back to backlog once again. So now we can see that we have created 2 stories and 2 test cases. So now that we've created 2 stories and 2 test cases that we can see here, we need to place them into a test set to make it a bit more organized. So next up, what we're going to do is we're going to create a test set. So this is going to be test set 001 for addition feature tests. Once again, we're going to assign it to version 1, and we're going to select the sprint. So we're going to create that. And we're going to go into our test set, and we're going to have to assign the test cases to this test set. So once we enter a test set, we'll see this option show up, and we're going to add existing tests. So the ones that we created. So add 3 numbers and add 2 numbers. Let's add those in. Okay, so far we've made the test cases, but I haven't assigned it to any of my stories yet. Okay, so if I go here, you can see it's uncovered. So I haven't added any tests in. So what I want to show you guys is what would it look like on our testing board. So our testing board shows us a variety of things. This here is the test repository. So this is like for better organizing your tests. What you can do with your test repository, just as an example, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can create folders for your tests. So let's say this is the addition feature tests. Okay, let's create this addition feature tests, and we can place inside our tests that we've made. So whenever we want to go back to our tests, we can go into our test repository and go into this folder, which we see the addition feature. Oh, sorry, I misspelled it. We can see it better organized, essentially. That's what our test repository is for. Also, let's see the test coverage so far. So this is for project calculator. And let's say for version 1.0, let's apply it. And this is for calculator project, version 1.0, apply it, let's generate a report. So we can see here, it says its status is uncovered. So we haven't covered any of them. So if I click on it, you can see which stories it's talking about. And we can see that there's no tests in it. So there's nothing. If you go into traceability, it's going to show you a report as well. So version, let's say 1.0, let's apply, generate a report. So you can see it here as well. So these are the requirements, are 2 stories, add 3 numbers and add 2 numbers, and we can see it's uncovered. There's no tests, there's no test runs, and there's no defects. So let's go back to our project. So now let's cover our stories with tests. So I'm going to click on this story over here, and I'm going to assign the tests here. So let's click add tests. And this is going to be to add 2 numbers, or add 2 numbers. And I'm going to go back to backlog again and go into my next story, which is to add 3 numbers. So I'm going to add tests and add 3 numbers. Okay, so now you can see that the stories have tests associated with them. Let's go back onto our testing board, and I'm going to show you guys what it will look like in the test coverage. So now that we've covered our stories, we should find that it should be a little bit different. So let's generate a report. And we can see now, instead of uncovered, it's not run. So now we can see that one test has been assigned to each of the 2 stories. So if I go into traceability and generate a report, we can see each of the tests assigned to each story. So now instead of uncovered, it's now not run. We haven't run it yet. Okay, let's head back onto the testing board. And we have covered, we've made our version, we made our sprint 1, we've made the stories, we've made the test cases and covered each of the stories with the tests with each test case. We've made our test set. Our final thing is to do our test execution for sprint 1. Now we need to execute our tests. So let's create a test execution. So let's call it TE001 execution for sprint 1. So as we've done before, assign it to version 1 and assign it to sprint 1 for this project. Okay. Now, if we go into the execution for sprint 1, instead of assigning individual tests to the execution, because we made a test set, we can just add the test set in. So let me show you guys. So for this test set, which was the addition features tests, we can see that it's automatically added in the 2 test cases that we made. So that is the benefit of creating a test set. So it just it contains the test already, and we can easily just add them in. All right, now that we've created our test execution, let's start our sprint. Duration for 2 weeks, and let us start. Okay, so this is what your sprint is going to look like. You're going to make the features, add 2 numbers and add 3 numbers, and you're going to finish them. Next thing you want to do is you want to test each of them. So that's going to be in progress. And if you look into your execution, so let's click on it. You can see here, you can change the status to executing. So let's change the executing status here. And if we head on to our testing board, let's look at the traceability report here. Generate report. We can see that it's now executing. So traceability gives you a more detailed overview of what stories and what tests and what test runs it falls under. So you can see now that we have test runs filled up here as well. All right, so let's head back to our testing board and let's go into our active sprint, the sprint that we're currently running. And let's say that we encounter a bug for one of our tests. So I'm going to click on this button here, and it's going to take me to that. Here we can see the test details. We can see which stories it covers, and we can see that it's currently executing. Let's add a defect to this. So let's create a defect. Test defect 001. Let's say the output was -6 instead. Let's create that in. So if I head back to my testing board, head on back to traceability and create a report, I can see that a defect is now added in here as well. So one of the things with the traceability report is that you can share it and you can also export it. You have these 2 options. The same options exist in test coverage as well. You can share it, and what we're going to do is now we're going to head back to our active sprint. All right, so let's say we have finished our execution. So I'm going to edit this, and let's say we have now passed one of them and we have failed another. Now let's consider it done. Let's go on to our testing board once again, and I'll show you guys what it looks like. So head down to traceability. We should see the current state. So we see that the story has passed, and there was a defect here. It's done. And this one says NOK, which stands for not okay. We can see that this one has failed, and we can see in which test execution it's failed in. All right, so that is for sprint 1. But let's head on to sprint 2. So we're going to do the same thing in sprint 2. We're basically going to create these 2 stories, and we're going to make the test cases and assign it to a test set. But one additional thing that we'll find in sprint 2 is we're going to make another test set as well. So let's head on here, and we're going to create a sprint. This is sprint 2. Let's assign it, let's make another version to version 2.0. This is going to be for subtraction features. We can assign it a start date and a release date as well. And I'm going to exit this here. So for our next sprint, let's make a test set. Let's make the regression test set. So in our regression test set, I'm going to assign it no versions and no sprints. It's going to be a test set on its own, which I'm not going to assign to any sprint, because in later sprints, I'm going to just continue adding on previous test cases that were made in each of the sprints, and you'll see that I'll add it into the test execution of a sprint, not into just directly into the sprint itself. So I'll show you guys an example of that when I create all the stories and the test cases and the test set addition subtraction features. Once again, let me just show you guys. If you go onto our testing board and you head on down to test coverage, and this time you want to change scope to version 2. So again, let's add in version 2 for version 2, and let's generate a report. So now you can see that these ones are uncovered as well. Okay, heading on back to our backlog, we have our stories, our test cases that we need to make. Writing and creating these tests can be quite tedious. So I have another video which does it directly through a CSV file. So if you would just create all your tests from a CSV file in Excel or whatever, and you just import it into your project, you can see it automatically added in. So instead of manually doing it, you can do it straight from a CSV file. So I have already made a video addressing how to do that, which is quite helpful as well. So again, here is our test case. We made steps to it, and let's make another one. Let's create finally a test set, which is going to be test set 002 subtraction features here. Fixed versions for 2.0 for sprint 2. Create that. And of course, we're going to have to add in each of our tests into this test set. So a regression test set. Let's look into a regression test set. A regression test set has to cover tests from our first sprint and our second sprint. So let's add those tests in. So we're going to subtract 2 numbers, add 2 numbers, add 3 numbers, and add 2 numbers. So let's add that all in. So now we can see 4 test cases have been added from each of our sprints. So we're going to go back to our backlog. And now that we've made our sprint 2 and it has everything that I've defined over here, our 2 stories and each test case covering that story, a test set, as well as the regression test set. So I'm going to add that in to our test execution. Okay, so I'm going to create a test execution now. This is going to be for our second sprint. So test execution, let's call it 2. This is going to be for sprint 2. Now, again, this is for version 2. This is for sprint 2. Create. Okay, now in our sprint and our execution 2 for sprint 2, I'm going to add in the test sets. Now, the test that I'm adding in is obviously going to be from the subtraction feature test sets as well as the regression test sets. So we'll see what happens here. We'll see that all 4 test cases have been added in. So from the ones from this sprint that we made, as well as from the previous sprint. Now let's go on to our backlog and let's finally, we can't start a sprint here because we haven't completed the other active sprint currently. So now we're going to go into our active sprint and we're going to complete the sprint over here. Okay, so now that we've done everything, we've made our tests, we've covered our tests, and we're done execution of our tests. For our stories, we're going to complete sprint. Okay, complete sprint. And I'm going to head back to project. So now we can finally start our next sprint. Okay, let's start it. So now you can see that we will do what we did before, but now we have to now we have to test 4 test cases. So that marks the end of our video. We've covered everything that I have described previously. We can see that I made 2 sprints and 2 versions, and you've looked at how each of those tests are created for your stories and test execution. I think one big feature in this video is the regression test set, which stacks up on previous test cases. So hopefully that was more in depth and more in detail of how to use Jira Xray for your projects. And I hope that helps, guys. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below and I will try my best to answer them as soon as possible. Thank you all for watching.